All right, welcome everybody, both in person and virtual. Thanks so much for being here. He said it's on, but it's very low in the. All right, I'll just project if our mics are not too up too high. So first of all, thank you so much for being here. My name is Benjamin Day. I'm a senior campaigner at Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth is a major environmental group in the U.S. We have 4 million members across the whole country in all 50 states. And we're going to be talking today about geoengineering, which is a weird, funny, but also scary kind of area of that we're dealing with climate change. And I'm going to just briefly define this because we're not going to assume that everyone in the audience knows what geoengineering is or knows much detail about it. The general definition of geoengineering is the deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment in order to counter the effects of climate change. So again, like I said, we're not going to assume that you know anything about geoengineering. We're going to be talking about the science and the politics of geoengineering from a fairly high level. But we're going to have 40 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you do know a lot about geoengineering and you want to get into the weeds with us, you can ask questions at that point. So today, our panel is kind of a mix of researchers, large environmental organizations, and frontline communities that are most likely to be impacted. And I think it's fair to say we all have a fairly critical perspective on geoengineering, coming from a place of like deep concern of what could happen if geoengineering is mainstreamed as a tool for addressing climate change. But if you're looking for a more positive angle on geoengineering, particularly from the companies that are working to develop them, there's no shortage of those. At New York Climate Week, I've been to a couple myself. So the scope of geoengineering that we're going to talk about today, and this is the last thing I'll say before I introduce our panelists, is that geoengineering is generally divided into two categories. One is solar radiation modification, trying to reflect the sun's rays into space to cool the planet. And the other is carbon dioxide removals. Arti Gupta is going to focus in particular on solar radiation modification. When it comes to carbon dioxide removal, we're not going to be able to cover everything. We were going to have a marine biologist talk about marine geoengineering. He came down sick. So fortunately, Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group has stepped in for him. She's not a scientist, but she has a long history of organizing around geoengineering, including marine geoengineering. So she's going to talk about marine geoengineering, probably more from a political community perspective. She's joining us virtually. So thank you to Silvia for stepping in and rescuing us last minute. We're not going to be talking a lot about the land-based carbon dioxide removals. All right, so without further ado, we're going to start with, let me find my intro for Silvia here. Okay, so Silvia Ribeiro, who's joining us virtually, is the Latin American director of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology, and Concentration, which is also known as the ETC Group, based in Mexico. And with the ETC Group, Silvia has participated in the negotiations of several UN treaties on the environment, climate, biodiversity, and food. She has critically followed the debate and developments of geoengineering and its actors for well over a decade. So thank you, Silvia, for joining us. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Great, fantastic. Yes, everyone can hear you. And we're going to start your slides as well. I think.
So, okay, I don't see the slides, but I hope I can see them, so I see what you're showing.
Okay, we have the slides. That might be a little difficult for you, actually, but. Okay. Okay. Can you see the slides now, Silvia?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. Lots of tech fun. Can you open it up, Silvia, and follow along? We can advance for you.
Okay. Okay, so you can see the slides, right?
Yes.
So we are on slide 1. Okay.
Yep. You advance to the next
one. Okay, that's good. Okay. Oh, now I can see the slides.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. Okay, please take the next one. So, because I am starting, it's a bit strange because I will start directly into marine geoengineering, just because I understand that James Carey, Dr. Carey, couldn't join us today. But of course, I should have started by saying in general, like Ben was saying, that geoengineering is the attempt to manipulate technologically and at grand scale, at mega scale, ecosystems of the Earth to try to influence some of the symptoms of climate change, particularly the excess of carbon dioxide and temperature. So applied to marine ecosystems, there are, according to the scientific groups of the London Conventions, there are over 40 different technologies, but these are the most not only well-known, but also the ones that are being planned as experiments. And we have these technologies that you can read there that basically aim to either manipulate the chemistry or the living ecosystem, the living forms in the seas like plankton and algae and others to absorb more carbon, or to sink biomass and this plankton and algae that are cultivated into the bottom, and hoping that the carbon that is absorbed by these plants will stay there. But there are also other forms, which is solar geoengineering, like marine cloud brightening and reflective microbubbles and others, that what they aim is to make the seas, or in some cases ice, more reflective, so it can theoretically lower the temperature. And can you pass to the next one, please? Yeah, so generally, let me say that none of these technologies has been really, it can really be certain that it will function. Most of theoretical technologies, and in many cases, it's very, very far away from saying that they really absorb carbon permanently, but also it's very far away from being technologies that will function in the way that they are thought to. And this is one of the largest shortcomings of geoengineering, which is that to know if the technologies will really have any influence on the climate system, they will need to be deployed at really very large scale and a long time. And that is one of the problems, because that means that it doesn't have any experimental phase. Can you take the next one, please? So this is a very rough description of the impacts on marine ecosystems. Of course, they depend partially on the technologies, but among the different impacts that they can have is to create turbidity and contamination, both chemical and organic, a disruption of the ocean chemistry in non-desired ways. It definitely, in most cases, will create shadows and reduce light and oxygen, change temperature also in non-desired ways. In many of the biological proposals, it will disrupt the marine food chain. It may promote growth of toxic algae, contamination of pathogens to natural vegetation, and also have other impacts on carbon cycle that may even release more greenhouse gases than thought initially. So not only by the effects on the sea, but also because of the energy demand of the technologies. There are also multiple risks to deep sea. There are a large group of scientists that are specifically focused on the impacts of geoengineering on deep sea that are extremely concerned, because also the deep sea is a system that is not so well known that other parts of the ocean. And the ocean in general and the marine ecosystems are are dynamic systems that are interactive in many ways. So there are many unknown impacts on biodiversity, potential cascade reactions on complex dynamic systems. And also, in many cases, damage to the fauna by infrastructure, and this is due to the amount, to the scale. It will also, because of this, have a lot of impacts on coastal communities and traditional livelihoods. Again, depending of the technology we're speaking about will be different, but for instance, in the case of algae, of course, it will have a lot of impacts, negative impacts on artisanal algae cultivator. In the case of enhanced ocean alkalinity, it will enhance a lot mining, but also all the infrastructure that is needed to do this, depending also on how they do it. Can you take the next one, please? So I was thinking that I could give you some examples, and this is one of the first geoengineering technologies that were targeted by UN and also by civil society, which is ocean fertilization. And ocean fertilization is about spreading iron or other substances, but mostly iron, it can be urea, to promote a sudden plankton bloom. And the plankton is supposed to absorb carbon and then sink to the bottom and retain carbon. And this has been abundantly studied. And in many cases, in most cases, it shows that the absorption happens, the plankton bloom happens, but it's not permanent, and sometimes it's really very short. This is one of the technologies that has been regulated since some years ago, starting with the Convention on Biological Diversity that established a moratorium, but also the London Convention and London Protocol. And still there are experiments, but they have changed the name of ocean fertilization to others, like, for instance, whale poo. But it's the same, it's kind of ocean fertilization. And there is a center in the UK planning multiple projects in different parts of the world. Can I see the next one? So these impacts that I'm mentioning here are the impacts that were taken into consideration by the Convention on Biological Diversity to establish a moratorium on ocean fertilization. And it's about disruption of the marine food web and hypoxia or anoxia in deeper layers of the ocean, the production of toxic algal blooms and harmful gases, the worsening of ocean acidification, and the risk of proliferation due to commercial exploitation. Can we go to the next one, please? So another example is the issue of algae and large-scale algae cultivation. And when we see all the models, like the first picture that I showed to you, it seems that these are like a boat dumping something, or in the case of algae, a small algae cultivation. It is not. One of the projects that are now ongoing is about 95,000 square kilometers of algae. And to give you a general quick picture, this is about a monoculture of actual algae. It's not an ecosystem, it will never be. It's like comparing a plantation with a forest. So this in itself has a lot of impacts on the sea because of the shadow, because of the pathogens, because of the space that is taken, because of deviation of nutrients. And it can create many other impacts. And it also is been very discussed that it retains any carbon at all. In fact, it says that it retains very, very little carbon. And when we see the whole life cycle after it has sunk to the bottom, it can even turn to a carbon emitter. It could have really serious potential impacts of deep sea because of the mass sinking of this huge plantation. And that is the only way that it could have any impact on climate change. Okay, next one. So there are also specific impacts of solar geoengineering on marine ecosystem. This slide particularly is from James Gary, and they have focused, their organization, Ocean Care, has particularly focused on the impacts of solar geoengineering on marine ecosystem. And as we can see, there are multiple ecosystems, including underwater noise impacts, but also altered upwelling, which is the normal circulation of water inside the ocean. It can also affect the use of chemicals by spreading particles in the sea. Reflective particles can also have an impact on fish and other of similar impacts. Can we go to the next one? So I just wanted to mention particularly marine cloud brightening, which is one of the solar geoengineering applied to marine, because there was an ongoing project in Australia. It is ongoing yet, but also there is one in the US that was attempted to be an experiment in Alameda City, and the council rejected it fully because of the potential risk that it could have, but also because it was not really communicated with the population. So this happened in 2024. Can we go to the next one? And marine cloud brightening, which is about, it's kind of a spraying marine clouds with salt water, could be salt water. But if this is really deployed at the scale needed to influence the climate, it will have really very serious impacts. For instance, the calculation that has been done is that it could be deployed over the whole Pacific coast of the Americas, the 3 Americas. So it could also produce substantial rainfall reduction over Amazon. It could generate droughts over the Amazon, increase runoff over land, impacts on sea due to the large amount of vessels, because this is not in the picture that I show, it shows boats. It could be non-tripulated vessels, but in many cases it will be a large amount of vessels that will by themselves disrupt the marine system. It's also a serious distraction from addressing the real causes of coral reef degradation, because it is attempted as a way of creating lower temperature over the coral reefs. But in reality, it disregards coastal contamination, pollution, industrial overfishing, and ocean warming will continue anyway. So it also shares, all the solar geoengineering technologies share some impacts, which is that if deployed at large scale, they will cause droughts and floods in other regions, and also it will be a termination shock, a sudden temperature rise. Can we go to the next one? So marine geoengineering is under moratoria at UN, and there are 2 UN places where it has been discussed most. This is in the Convention on Biodiversity, that has a de facto moratorium on ocean fertilization since 2008, and a de facto moratorium on all climate geoengineering since 2010. The London Convention and London Protocol, that is about ocean dumping, has done several studies. And in 2008, they called for extreme precaution on ocean fertilization. And in 2013, the London Protocol issued a decision that implies a prohibition of ocean fertilization because of impacts. In all cases, there are exceptions for a small-scale experiment for scientific purposes, but not as a technology that can be deployed in commercial scale as it is being projected. So in 2024, the London Convention, London Protocol, the scientific groups are considering the impacts of ocean alkalinity, algae cultivation and biomass sinking, marine cloud brightening, and reflective parties, among other technologies, but these are the most important. And in 2023, they issued, the parties of the London Convention issued a cautionary call, that said that potential for these techniques to have deleterious effects, especially where those may be widespread, long-lasting, or severe, and they call countries to not allow the large-scale use of this technology. Can we go to the next one? And it's the last one. So if you want to have more information, this is from the civil society side. You can go to Geoengineering Monitor, that has a lot of technology briefings. It can describe each technology more in detail. And also, there is an interactive map on geoengineering experiments where you can see where are the experiments that I have mentioned and others. You can also go to ETC Group, and there is the Hands Off Mother Earth Alliance, which is an alliance of over 200 organizations, over 50 countries, that has a critical view that is against the deployment of geoengineering. There is a statement on marine geoengineering that I recommend that you see, that will be like a kind of summary of many of the points that I made today. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Benjamin.
All right,
And
thank you
thank
so
you
much,
all.
Sylvia. Really appreciate it. And if you folks have questions for Sylvia, we're just going to kind of go through the presentations and then do a long Q&A at the end. So just hold your questions on the marine side. Next speaker I want to introduce is Panganga Pungawi. Panganga is the Climate Geoengineering Organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network. She's been at IEN for 3 years, and she's an indigenous mother from Sivungak. Did I enough? Okay. Located on Dana Ina lands in so-called Anchorage, Alaska. Panganga has been involved in many grassroots efforts seeking justice for indigenous people, including efforts to protect lands and water from extractive industry, the campaign for missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, and domestic violence and sexual assault against indigenous women. For a decade, she worked with public health models to address suicide in indigenous communities, and she's also an indigenous full spectrum birth worker. So thank you so much.
I know that you guys can't hear me on the mic, but it's important for folks online. I'm going to talk a little bit about some data collection we've done over the past couple of years up in Alaska regarding Arctic perceptions of geoengineering. We contracted with a group called Saylor and Associates. They're local data evaluators. Dr. Saylor used to run the research department over in the University of Alaska for several years. And they also reached out to an Arctic researcher to help us generate questions, because we weren't only asking them, can you go to the next slide? We weren't only asking them of, well, first of all, we spoke mainly about 2 projects. First, we were talking mainly about Arctic Ice Project, which is where they wanted to dump millions of tons of silica hollow glass microspheres onto the Arctic ice. We were concerned about this project because they began testing in Utqiagvik by dumping football fields worth of this material on the ice without the free, prior, and informed consent of the tribal community. They did go through a for-profit corporation who is associated with the indigenous community, but they didn't talk to the tribes themselves, and they didn't speak to the community. So of course we were very concerned about this. And as we were starting to do this data collection, we learned of another organization called Real Ice. And these folks are based in Wales, UK. And while we were collecting data in Nome, they came and they did an experiment in Nome without having spoken to any of the tribes as well. So the concerns were that both of these could pose some serious but unknown consequences in the Arctic environment at scale, both in the testing itself and at scale. And then we also wanted to talk to people about their opinions on free, prior, and informed consent in indigenous communities. Next slide. So we wanted to get mostly an indigenous response to this, but we also wanted to speak to Arctic researchers, because there are people who are Arctic researchers who have worked in our communities for decades, and they've done so very well, and they've done so ethically, and they've done so in a way that respects our traditional knowledge. So we looked at affected populations, mostly indigenous peoples. We view experts and other subsistence gatherers as experts in our communities, local leaders, tribal leaders, Arctic researchers, and then other researchers who are just concerned with issues around informed consent as well. And the way that we collected data, I don't know if there's any data geeks in here. This isn't like a survey where you have to collect a certain percentage of the population. These were a series of key informant interviews and focus groups, and you collect that data until you hit redundancy. So in other words, you collect that data until you start hearing the same things over and over again, and that's where we paused our collection. And so this just captures some of the, there might be some there might be some bad language in here, so sorry in advance. So can you go to the next slide? So one of the first things we noticed was there was little to no awareness of the geoengineering projects that were happening in people's communities. And we didn't just talk about this, we talked about other forms of geoengineering. And we had to do so in a way that did not taint the data. In other words, we had to make sure that we did not have any tone whatsoever in our explanation of these technologies. We wanted to collect as clean data as possible. So some of the first impressions, I see a danger with the mindset that people from the outside are just going to come in and save the planet, and we don't want to hear any of the traditional knowledge. And that's generally the attitude that folks have seen. Inupiaq people have been in the area for tens of thousands of years and don't take kindly to people who think they've discovered a new continent when they visit the North Slope. This was about the Real Ice initiative. So it was a lady from Texas who was funding it and wanted to make a documentary, and another guy from the UK. They said they were looking at a few places. They wanted it to be easily accessible from the road. And when I advised them to talk to the tribes, at least the lady was like, we're doing a small scope pilot project. That seems like a lot of work to do before a pilot project. And then I think researchers need to build relationships. I think that's the biggest thing. We have scientists come in and out of communities constantly. They want to get published, they want to get recognized in their own career, and they don't have investments in our way, you know, in our best interests. And I won't read all of them, but these were, there was little or no awareness. Still, there's a clear sense that geoengineering sponsors don't respect traditional indigenous knowledge. So we have lived in relationship with the Arctic ice for thousands of years. We know the patterns of the ice. We know how ice is formed just based on how it looks. We know how long ago it was formed. We know which life forms depend on that particular type of ice. And when folks come in from the outside, particularly people who are funded in a university from Silicon Valley, and they've never had a relationship with the ice, let alone a relationship with the community who has a relationship with the ice. And then they come in and they don't tap in to our knowledge in a way that's respectful, you know, not just tapping into our knowledge in a way that's going to extract something that's going to further their own careers, extract something that's going to back up their ideas, and otherwise not tokenizing our knowledge. So it's not just about not recognizing our knowledge, but not tokenizing our knowledge. So there's a danger of people unfamiliar with the Arctic misunderstanding the health and welfare of people who live here. Oftentimes, researchers who are not familiar with the Arctic, who have not lived in the Arctic or around Indigenous peoples, have an assumption that they know what's best for Arctic communities and that they know what's best for Indigenous peoples. But if you don't know us, then quite frankly, you don't know that. So there was just an awareness that there was no respect from the folks who were coming in. There was little awareness of the opportunity to collaborate. So there was a feeling from Indigenous communities that their input was not valued. And let me say this also, when this concern was brought up, one of the projects, Arctic Ice Project in particular, their solution was to place one Indigenous person on their board, as if that would have any value whatsoever in terms of having our voice out there. Free, prior, and informed consent puts Native people on the defensive. In other words, that's That's the floor. That's the bottom. That's not the standard of what we need. Free, prior, and informed consent assumes that stuff is done always outside of us, and we give permission to what's done to us by other people. So that's just like always putting us on the defensive to begin with. And that bottom quote is from a researcher, I believe. Traditional knowledge is essential in conducting research in the Arctic. And when we were speaking to people about this, they were talking about how that consultation needed to happen prior to the problem being identified and way prior to the solution being identified. So what people noticed was even when folks were being consulted, this was way after, like they've already picked the restaurant, picked the menu, picked your dish, sat you down and said, do you want to come to dinner? Right? They didn't talk to us about what our idea of what the problem or solution was. Just keep going. So there was a really big theme on the cosmovision on Mother Nature. There's some profanity there. Sorry. So folks recognize and understand that Mother Nature is capable of healing herself. And that if you mess with that, if you try to meddle with that, then there are going to be consequences to those who are trying to interfere with that. We recognize that everything is in balance the way that it is on purpose, and that we cannot duplicate that balance ourselves as human beings. Keep going. Lots of concerns about the actual food chain. Folks knew exactly how geoengineering techniques would impact the food chain. For instance, Arctic blue cod lay their eggs at the bottom of the ice, and the Real Ice Project wanted to place water pumps on top of the ice, suck water from underneath and spill it over the top to thicken the ice. But that would interfere with the blue cod. It would completely destroy the eggs, and it would destroy the algae that's growing underneath and all the other life forms that depend on that ice as well. And it wouldn't thicken it in the balance of freeze melt cycle that the rest of the ice is subject to based on weather patterns and like temperature variance. And so ice is actually thicker if you allow it to freeze and melt and freeze and melt. But folks weren't recognizing that. Just keep going, yeah. There's a lot of baggage when it comes to Arctic researchers. Like I said, there's a few researchers who have been there for decades who do wonderful things with our community. But there is like they are far outweighed by people who come in who have never been there before, who just want to further their own careers and continue their projects. Going. Yeah, so we have very different worldviews and integrating philosophies. And the difference is one of us is oppressed and the other one is funded privately by millionaires or billionaires, by universities, by public funding, and we are not funded. So like the idea that one worldview is the worldview that is backed by funding, and therefore all of us have to live by that worldview is very immoral and very concerning. Keep going. So this is actually something that's been taken advantage of by some of these geoengineering projects. There's no clear line, unless you really, really dig, to who has jurisdiction over what. Like, who is in charge of the water when you're 3 miles out, 5 miles out, 30 miles out? All of that changes and depends on whether you're around tribal territories, which country you're in, federal, state, sometimes private. And so that lack of knowledge generally allows for folks to come in because sometimes people don't know that they're violating regulations. Keep going. There is clear disapproval of geoengineering. And we didn't even get to talk to them about carbon markets and how all of that plays into geoengineering as well. Keep going. The bottom line, it takes time to work with communities, a lot more time than 6 months, a year, 2 years, takes decades, really. Keep going. So Alaska Native people and Arctic researchers are concerned about the negative impacts of geoengineering. Most of the concerns, because we're in the Arctic center around the ice itself, ice is already melting from climate change. People know very well about that. They feel the affected communities have not been properly consulted or involved in a way that's not being tokenized. The feelings are not new. Traditional knowledge and customs do not appear valued by researchers in general. Local people are seldom asked to propose a project or advance a research question, nor are they funded to do so. And people are not notified in a timely manner and are sometimes bogged down by bureaucracy. So they'll dump a 3,000-page document and say, you've got 2 weeks to respond to this, and it's not translated into our traditional languages. Local notification and review systems are insufficient. Projects are regional, but require review by numerous tribal entities. So there's 200, over 200 federally recognized tribes in Alaska. And sometimes they'll only like send it to one organization. And it's clear that free, prior, and informed consent and National Science Foundation principles are not being followed. That's it.
All right, thank you so much, Panganga. So our next speaker is going to be Mary Church. Mary is the Geoengineering Campaign Manager at the Center for International Environmental Law's Fossil Economy Program. She's based in the UK. Prior to joining CL, Mary was head of campaigns at Friends of the Earth Scotland for over a decade. So that's how you know you can trust her. So Mary is going to talk a little bit about governance and what we have currently in terms of regulatory frameworks for geoengineering, or what we don't have currently for regulations. So thanks, Mary.
Do I need to be closer? Is that better? One of the things we often hear from advocates of geoengineering, or at least advocates of researching and developing geoengineering technologies, is that there is no governance and it's a wild west out there, and that we need some kind of governance regime to be put in place to facilitate research, technology development, perhaps, and even deployment. But that ignores the fact that, as actually Sylvia highlighted briefly in her talk previously, that ignores the fact that there has been a de facto moratorium in place on all forms of geoengineering since 2010 under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that was a consensus decision that no geoengineering activities, so this is, actually this is, I think this is the wrong slide. Could we ping to, yes, this one, thank you. That no geoengineering activities that could affect biodiversity could take place until various criteria are met, if you see on the screen. And because geoengineering by its very nature involves intervening in Earth systems at a large or even planetary scale, it would inevitably affect and pose really fundamental risks to biodiversity. So it's hard to see how these criteria could ever be met. There is this exemption for small-scale experiments, but of course that is heavily caveated, and it's really doubtful if many or any of the outdoor experiments that we're seeing in recent years would actually meet these tests in the moratorium. And furthermore, this decision refers back to, I'm sorry, I might have got the order of my slides wrong, but could we go back to the decision IX16C? I don't know which direction that will be in. Oh, no, it would be back then, yeah. So the decision that puts in place the de facto moratorium refers back to this earlier decision of the CBD, which deals with ocean fertilization, which, as Sylvia mentioned, was, that was the first big geoengineering experimentation that really kicked off this regulatory regime under the CBD and also under the London Convention. And this decision makes clear that any commercial aspect or the selling of carbon credits would effectively rule out experimentation as not legitimate scientific research. And that's really key, particularly in terms of what we see as one of the key drivers of many of the research experiments that are being proposed and taking place today. So emerging in parallel to the CBD moratorium is a restrictive regime for marine geoengineering at the London Convention and its protocol. We can, I think that's probably 2 slides down now. Yeah, this exactly, thank you. And so the London Convention and its protocol regulate pollution in the marine environment. And this regime effectively prohibits ocean fertilization. And it also includes perhaps a more detailed definition of what constitutes legitimate scientific research. It's very complementary to the CBD regime and a little bit more detailed in that respect. And again, this very clearly excludes projects with a commercial interest and requires that they would have to have a very clear scientific justification to be permitted under this regime. And at present, this covers ocean fertilization, but parties have indicated their intention to include a further 4 categories of marine geoengineering in this regulatory regime, so including ocean alkalinity enhancement, biomass cultivation, so the industrial seaweed farming and biomass sinking and dumping at the bottom of the ocean, microbubbles to increase the reflectivity of the surface of the ocean, a form of solar radiation modification, and also marine cloud brightening, which Sylvia talked about earlier as well. So parties really keen to bring those 4 categories of geoengineering under the same precautionary framework. So that's 2 UN regimes that have put in place pretty strong, pretty comprehensive, and highly restrictive frameworks for geoengineering already. And then in terms of broader international law, if we could go on to the next slide. The CBD moratorium is obviously based on the precautionary principle, which clearly comes into play in relation to geoengineering technologies, which are untestable for their intended impact on the climate, other than through large-scale or planetary scale deployment, right? By which time, of course, any harmful and potentially irreversible impacts can be locked in. So the precautionary principle, should be enough to rule out geoengineering from day dot. The obligation not to cause transboundary harm is also highly relevant in relation to geoengineering approaches. Again, think about the scale, think about what's being proposed. It's impossible to envisage geoengineering that doesn't have harmful transboundary impacts with some of these marine geoengineering technologies, it's envisaged to have like a meaningful impact on the climate. It's talked about using 10% of the ocean surface for dumping of minerals or other chemicals in the ocean for ocean alkalinity enhancement, for ocean fertilization as well. We're talking about 10% of the ocean surface. That is absolutely vast in terms of the planetary scale. Then we also have the obligation not to pollute the marine environment under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the recent ITLOS advisory opinion also really helpfully highlighted in relation to marine geoengineering. And of course, many of the marine geoengineering techniques proposed are essentially, they involve directly polluting the environment. So dumping biomass, dumping minerals, dumping harmful chemicals into the ocean. And then in terms of human rights, yes, exactly this one. There are a wide range of obligations that are of relevance, ranging from the right to life, to the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment, the right to healthy drinking water, the right to food, children's rights. And the Human Rights Council, so these excerpts all come from a report of the Human Rights Council's Advisory Committee, which was last year, and I won't run through them all, but it will be there for longer than I'm speaking, so you can read through it yourself. I just want to highlight a few key points from this. They warned that millions, if not billions, of people's human rights could be adversely impacted by the deployment of geoengineering technologies. And they furthermore warned that indigenous peoples, peasants, traditional communities, people on the front lines of the climate crisis were most at risk from the deployment of these technologies. I also want to flag a really important point emphasized here, which is that deterrence to cut emissions may be amplified in the near future by a public debate increasingly focused on the topic of carbon removal rather than carbon cuts and research path dependencies, and that the current focus of climate action should be on deploying existing, tested, and safe measures and technologies using a rights-based approach in line with the findings of the IPCC. So that's the broad scope of human rights. Panganga has already highlighted issues about what's referred to as free, prior, and informed consent and the limitations of that. But it is worth noting that it exists in international law, and it is also not being respected very clearly in many of the experiments that have gone ahead. And there are also broader rights of access to information, participation in decision-making, and of course, access to justice and remedy. And again, just thinking about the scale of what's proposed. So in terms of the geographical scale, but also the duration, like how long would we have to be doing some of the, Artie's going to talk more about solar radiation modification, stratospheric aerosol injection in particular. And we're talking about generations, hundreds of years of deployment. So thinking about how you can possibly take those procedural rights or indeed other human rights seriously in that context. So that amounts to a pretty broad range of decisions, principles, and norms of international law that when you take them together, it should be enough to stop geoengineering in its tracks. However, that's not what we're seeing in practice. And instead, we're seeing a proliferation of outdoor experiments, so open air and open water experiments, either planned or underway. And in no small part, this is being driven by voluntary carbon markets and being legitimized by the negotiations under the UNFCCC, under the Paris Agreement, proposals for a Paris Agreement carbon market mechanism, where various marine geoengineering technologies and techniques have been identified in guidelines for that mechanism. So again, thinking back to that, in the CBD and in the London Convention, the restrictions there that call out carbon markets and commercial aspects, that is, basically you've got the UNFCCC, the climate regime, pulling in a very different direction from the biodiversity, human rights, and other restrictive regimes on this front. I'm running out of time, but I just want to talk very briefly about resistance to geoengineering. So we're obviously seeing communities fight back across the world and winning in some important cases. So yeah, local communities have delayed an ocean alkalinity enhancement project in Cornwall in the UK. We saw the flagship Harvard University SCOPEX stratospheric aerosol injection project that was officially cancelled this year after years of resistance from indigenous-led resistance and resistance from further afield as well. We heard about the marine cloud brightening experiment in California earlier this year that was also, defeated by the local council. Sylvia also mentioned, over 100 organizations have signed on to a statement by the Hands Off Mother Earth Alliance earlier this year, again calling out marine geoengineering experiments in particular. We're also crucially seeing leadership at the political level, Global South leadership in particular, in resisting the normalization of geoengineering. So last year, African Ministers' Conference for the Environment called for a non-use mechanism in their decision from that conference. And that was the position that the Africa Group took into negotiations on a controversial resolution on solar radiation modification at the United Nations Environment Assembly earlier this year, which inadvertently or otherwise, that resolution basically risked undermining the protections that we already have in the CBD moratorium. And what we saw there was strong leadership from the Africa Group, also Pacific Island states playing a really important role, and many Latin American countries as well, in preventing that resolution getting worse. And ultimately, it was withdrawn, and the conversations that were had there laid, quite an important foundation for building on what we have at the CBD and towards non-use. And again, even more recently than that, we've seen here in New York in just the last few days, we've seen the president of Namibia, who was the co-facilitator for the process that led to the Pact for the Future, which was announced at the Summit of the Future this weekend, of course. He used his opening plenary address to the UN at the Summit of the Future to call out the dangers of geoengineering. And we also had a fantastic side event yesterday on solar radiation governance, where the government of Vanuatu spoke very powerfully against solar radiation modification and reiterated a position of non-use, and the German government expressing an openness to dialogue on a non-use agreement. So there's really this sense of momentum building towards it. So I'm going to stop because I'm over time, and I'm sorry about that, and hand over to Artie, who's going to talk more about this idea of a non-use agreement and why that's the right direction to go in. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. Our last speaker is going to be Professor Artie Gupta. Professor Gupta is a professor of global environmental governance at Wageningen University. I tried my best. In the Netherlands. Her research focuses on global environmental and climate governance, including questions of transparency and accountability and anticipatory governance of novel technologies such as biotech and climate engineering. So that is right up our alley. Thank you so much.
Is it possible to stand, or do I?
Yeah, you can hold this.
Yeah. I prefer that. I think I'm more easily visible that way. So this is only for the online because I don't hear anything happening with, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, for inviting me to the party as well. I think it's really useful to have this exchange of perspectives, which this UN setting allows for, the fact that we're all here also for the Summit for the Future and other important at Climate Week. And as was mentioned, we also convened, so this was an academic initiative to convene a session yesterday during the Science Week on solar geoengineering governance. And there we had the opportunity really not just to have scientists and academics, researchers talking to each other, which we do a lot of, but also to hear from government, civil society, indigenous community representatives, youth representatives. So this took a long time. It was a 4-hour session. And that was very, very fruitful to also hear whether these ideas about what kind of governance one needs for solar geoengineering, how these resonate with governments, with other stakeholders. So that was very useful. I see some familiar faces from that session. So just to flag, of course, that my story hasn't changed from yesterday. It would be a little bit strange if I came with a whole new story. So for those of you who were there yesterday, you'll get a repeat of that basically in its essence, but I hope we'll have some time to discuss as well afterwards. So can I have the next? Yeah, I guess the core question for us as researchers, critical researchers, my background is political science, international relations, global governance, global environmental and climate governance. And for me, the question is, and this is a question which is a first order question, could governance of solar geoengineering technologies could there be global governance of solar geoengineering technologies which would be fair, effective, and stable over a very long period of time? As Mary mentioned, if we talk about solar geoengineering interventions, those would need to be over a long, sustained period of time. If we are looking for a planetary scale impact, bringing down average global temperatures, etc., that requires a sustained intervention. And when we say sustained, we're not just talking about a few years. We are talking about decades, minimum, or at least a century. So that's the nature of the exercise. So the question then that we need to ask ourselves at the outset, when we think about researching this technology towards potential technology development, which might then lead to deployment, we need to ask ourselves at the outset, could such a technology, if developed and deployed, ever be governed in this manner, effectively, safely, and in a stable manner and fairly, with all those who have a stake having a voice? And if you're talking about planetary scale intervention, then clearly there's a planetary scale stake in this. So that's the question. And of course, this question also has to be asked in the world that we live in, which is a highly unequal world, and it's a geopolitically fraught world. So it's not an ideal scenario where there's some benevolent, rational, global decision maker who's going to take decisions about a planet-altering technology for the greater good of all. That's sort of the assumption that that we'll all win from this. But clearly, we realize that there are winners and losers from anything. And the question then, of course, is how will we navigate winners and losers at a planetary scale? So that's sort of, that's setting the stage. So I want to offer just 3 propositions about this question about governance. And my focus is on one type of solar geoengineering, which is the one with the planetary scale impact, desired by definition, a planetary scale impact, which is sulfate aerosol injection, also called SAI. There are a lot of acronyms in this space, as there generally are in all UN processes. So here we're talking about, well, this is not a UN process, but there is an acronym here. It's called SAI. And I thought there was going to be a sort of scientific explanation of this, but just to say a little bit what this is, it's an injection of sulfate aerosol reflective particles into the stratosphere through a means such as aircraft, which actually that kind of aircraft doesn't yet exist. It would be specifically, you'd have to develop special aircraft which would have to fly 24/7 for decades or centuries to inject these reflective particles into the stratosphere. So that's what SAI is. And the idea is that these reflective particles would reflect some of the incoming sunlight back out into space and would therefore have a cooling effect to counteract the warming effect of accumulated carbon dioxide emissions. So that's the technology we're talking about. Could I have the next slide, please? So the propositions that I want to put forward here is, and there's a distinction also to be made when we talk about global governance of solar geoengineering, 2 aspects of the governance challenge, which are often conflated, and it's important to distinguish them. So when we talk about global governance, it's a very different kind of governance challenge if you're talking about governing the use of this technology, deployment. So because that entails what I was talking about, that deployment means flying hundreds of aircraft 24/7 for decades or centuries, injecting reflective particles into the stratosphere. That's the governance challenge of deployment. Governing non-use, a very different purpose of governance, is to say, could we govern globally to take this option off the table? To ensure that this technology doesn't get developed and therefore doesn't get deployed. That's a very different kind of global governance challenge. Sometimes those two are confused, because if we make the argument, as I say here, the first proposition is that fair, effective, and stable global governance of deployment is largely implausible, especially given our current global governance architectures or any others that we might dream up. But that is not to say that the present global governance architectures we have are also unsuitable to govern non-use. As I said, it's a very different challenge. So that often gets misunderstood. But my second proposition then is that if fair, effective, and stable global governance of deployment is largely implausible, and I'll say a few words about why we think that, then what we really need to do is to govern towards non-use, to govern to take solar geoengineering, particularly SAI, off the table as a future climate policy option. And the third point is, and this has been extensively covered by Mary, is to say that governing towards non-use is not, we wouldn't be starting from a clean slate. There's already a basis for it in international law and also in recent political developments, an announcement by key groups of countries, which is, of course, also a very important, also widespread support for this position of non-use also amongst indigenous communities, civil society groups, etc. So there's a lot that can be built on. Next slide, please. So the proposition one, which is about the implausibility of fair, effective, and stable global governance, I mean, I think this is, once one thinks about it, pretty self-evident, I would say, because we all recognize the world we live in, which consists of relatively weak global institutions. And they are weak not because there's something inherently deficient in the idea of multilateralism or global institutions, but because we live in a world of sovereign nation states and a decision for a preference not to cede sovereignty to the global context. So you don't have strong enforcement, etc. And therefore, global institutions are weak. Weak in the sense that there would not be the possibility to govern this sort of large-scale deployment in a fair and effective manner. The other aspect, of course, of the global governance architecture is that we find ourselves in we of course inhabit a very unequal world. So there's unequal access to a seat at the table, to resources, to technologies, to decision making. And that's the context within which a powerful planet-altering technology like SAI would land. It would land within this very unequal context. We govern within this very unequal context. So that's can you have the next slide, please? So in that situation, it's also important to specify then what is the global governance challenge posed by SEI? What would we need to decide globally in a sort of inclusive manner? What would be and this is, of course, this would require, so if we are talking about injecting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, and it would help, of course, to understand how this actually works. So the impact that this injection of sulfate aerosols would vary a lot depending on where sulfate aerosols were injected, how much injection was taking place, for how long. So these impacts would vary greatly depending on that, and their regional impacts and consequences for climate systems, but also for related systems, earth systems like precipitation or food systems, etc. There would be multiple impacts which we wouldn't really know until doing it. So essentially what we would need to come together and decide as a global community is when to inject, how much to inject, where to inject, for how long to inject, when to stop, And what would happen if something were to go wrong, and who would be responsible? Would we have means to attribute something going wrong, say in the climate system or the systems, to a particular intervention? Complex questions of liability, compensation, etc. And we know how liability compensation discussions have gone for the last 30 years in the climate context. So those kinds of decisions, and especially if these decisions would generate different winners and losers in different parts of the globe. So whose preferred global temperature would we be aiming for? Whose preferred precipitation patterns, or what kind of idealized climate would we want to be working towards? So that is, of course, a very complex question. And so our contention here is that there would not be the possibility to make these decisions in a way that would be inclusive and furthering, sort of the priorities of all countries. There would have to be choices. And the further contention is that placing such planet-altering technologies under the control of international institutions, the UN system, for example, would not be acceptable to those in a position of power, those in a position to actually develop and deploy such planet-altering technologies at the scale, time scales, and the spatial scales required. Can I have the next slide, please? Because what do we have currently? We are sitting here in the heart of the United Nations. What we have is the UN. What do we have globally to govern things, to govern towards whatever global challenge we want to address? We have the UN system. We have the one country, one vote system. So that, as we have seen in the Pact, for those of you who've been following the Pact for the Future discussions, this system gives developing countries a majority in key fora, like the UN General Assembly, for example. There was a discussion about reforming the international financial architecture to further the goals of sustainable development. And there's a resistance to doing that under a context of one country, one vote systems. For example, donor countries would prefer to have those discussions under the World Bank or the IMF, whether there's a different decision-making system where there's a voted majority for certain countries. So essentially, the idea that the US, for example, one of the countries most able to develop SAI technology and deploy it, would be willing to place a planet-altering technology under the control of the UN system, where it would have 1 out of 194 votes. Or if we were to imagine something else, we were to imagine such arrangements that don't yet exist, something along population, for example. Okay, I have 2 minutes, so I have to speed up. So with that, if we imagine something along the lines of, decision making by population, the US would have 4.2% of the vote. So the idea that powerful countries would place these technologies under the control of institutions where they don't have control is implausible. We do have the UN Security Council. We've again heard lots of discussion about reforming this institution, which is a holdover from the post-Second World War period, which is not legitimate in the sense of globally inclusive. It gives 5 countries veto power. What if we were to say, let's regulate this technology? It'll probably get regulated outside of a UN mandate. Maybe a few powerful countries come together in a coalition and decide to do something. But that would not then, of course, would leave a large chunk of the world out of this decision-making process and could lead to all kinds of very dangerous dynamics, because ultimately this planet-altering technology will not just be about climate change. It will be about security and militarization, etc. So it could exacerbate geopolitical tensions. Next slide, please. So with all of this, the main point here to say is that deployment could never be governed in a fair and effective and stable manner. It would require unprecedented global oversight, models of decision-making which don't exist. We'd essentially need a world government, which we don't have, and probably nobody is suggesting we should have one. So therefore, the idea that we can collectively come to govern this is highly implausible. Next slide, please. So I think I'm going to skip this. Essentially, the point being made here, there are various other concerns around the use of solar geoengineering and SAI. We go to the next slide. So with these concerns that it may also, keeping this option on the table may deter the mitigation that we really need urgently and the unequal, unknowable impacts that it may have, the position that a large group of academics, global governance scholars, climate scientists, but also all manner of academics who are very, very concerned about this have come together to call on political actors to say we should take this option off the table. We shouldn't move towards technology development. Once a technology is developed, it will be deployed. History teaches us that. So let's not get to a point we are trying endlessly for decades to deter the use of a powerful technology. Let's prevent technology development. This is not to say, this is not a position against academic freedom and fundamental knowledge generation and all of that. This is a group of academics calling for this. We are in the business of knowledge generation, but we think that certain technologies could be incredibly risky, and therefore we might decide not to go down that path. We do it, say, with gene editing or other things. We do it with human cloning, for example. So I think I need to, can we go to the next slide? So this is, no, just this one, the one before, yeah. We can talk about this in the discussion, what a non-use agreement, what we are suggesting could be component elements of a non-use agreement. Essentially, we say no deployment, no outdoor experimentation, no support in international institutions, etc., and that this would help to keep this option off the table. Yeah, I think I'm basically done. This was already mentioned by Mary that there are also some key political developments calling for this with Mexico and the African Council of Ministers. So those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Let's listen to what they are saying. The African group, Vanuatu, many other countries are saying non-use, using that language. So I think we have to at least acknowledge that those most impacted have a particular view on this, and it's not necessarily that they're misguided or have just sort of missed the point. And with that, I think I'll stop. This is something we can talk about, how a non-use agreement might actually be realized. It doesn't just require an international treaty, but there could be many other ways of realizing a non-use agreement. And I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And if we could get our panelists up here, we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. We can take in-person questions. Folks online, we can also take some of your questions. If you could put your questions in the chat section. I know there's a Q&A. Are you able to see that? Okay, never mind. If it's in the Q&A, we're good. We just figured it out. Okay, so I thought I would kick things off just by asking the panel one or two quick questions. The first question I have is that I think we all know that climate change is already and will continue to disproportionately impact kind of politically marginalized countries and communities, including coastal communities, island states, and the global south. So one thing we hear from advocates of geoengineering is that we essentially have a moral obligation to reverse the effects of climate change if we're able to, on behalf of those vulnerable communities. So how do you all kind of respond to that, or how do you see that?
Folks in my community have actually been very offended to hear that. Folks think that they're speaking on behalf of us, but they haven't even had a conversation with us. And if they have had a conversation with us, they generally haven't given us all of the information. So they haven't given us information about who's funding it. And generally, it's fossil fuel companies or billionaires who are funding this in order to greenwash their own organizations or their selves. I've heard it many times. It kind of makes me nauseous whenever I hear it. One time, there were a few geoengineering experts speaking to, I think it was the Human Rights Council, and one of them said, I would be remiss as a middle-class white woman not to advocate for a technology that Indigenous peoples would most benefit from. And I wasn't even, like, there were no Indigenous voices at the table at the time. And so, and the people who were there were not for geoengineering. And so it's pretty insulting to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's based on that argument is based on a pretty strange interpretation of what we know about the impacts of geoengineering, right? So we know that many of these techniques and technologies and theories, right, because many of them are simply at that very theoretical stage, are inherently
unpredictable in terms of their impacts. And in the case of stratospheric aerosol injection, we know that it would be uneven impacts. So, global cooling, yes, but not evenly distributed and likely to cause greater heating in parts of the world that are already most affected by climate change. So you inject over here and maybe you get some global cooling over here, but then you have, heat waves, fires, droughts, etc. in some other part of the world. So there'll be winners and there'll be losers, impacts far from the point of injection. Artie has touched on some of these points, like who's going to be in control of this technology? Who's going to be actually deploying this technology? Who's going to have the capacity to do that? Well, it's global North countries, isn't it? It's not global South countries. So it's really, it's not a very convincing argument.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I think that's one of the, I think, the most disingenuous claims that is made in this space, unfortunately. And that's not, just to start with, if you're concerned about alleviating suffering of those most impacted by climate change, the most vulnerable, we could be doing a lot more about that today. Why should we wait to alleviate suffering through developing this potentially highly risky technology and alleviate suffering 20 years from now or whenever? I mean, we've seen how the fight about loss and damage has gone, right, for the last 30 years. Where are the solar radiation modification advocates urging the political process to put large sums of money into the loss and damage facility? Where's that push coming from? Urging. Right, but how are you making it happen? As an...
Let me go preface by saying that.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, Hassan Sitra from the Alliance for Justice and British on Solar. I work on solar geoengineering simply because that's the only thing I believe in. I don't know very many geoengineering experts who do not preface everything they say without saying urgent mitigation.
That's a completely different argument. And nothing is completely different. Everything is related. But that particular point we can get to, I'm sure, in the discussion, because that is another very widely made claim. But I just wanted to finish my my discussion about my answer to this question. So one thing is that we could be doing a whole lot more. And all those millions that are increasingly going into SRM research could alleviate a substantial amount of suffering. We're fighting over every dollar or euro to go into the loss and damage facility. Every little bit counts, right? It's not a lot, but every little bit counts. The other thing is, I would ask those who make that claim, why would a solar geoengineered world look more fair and equitable and take into account the needs of the most vulnerable when there would be difficult trade-offs? Why would that world prioritize the poor and the sufferer, the marginalized, when today's world and the systems that we inhabit doesn't? Why would suddenly that world look magically different? It's just, I'd like to understand that. And of course, the question then ultimately is, who gets to speak for whom, right? And this is something that's come up. And what the non-use initiative from academics is, it's an academic perspective. And we are calling on political actors. Now, if the political process were to decide that solar geoengineering is the answer, then more power to that decision. But I think the other thing we have to see is that the political process, the multilateral process, where there's some hope of everybody having a seat at the table in the sense of however that's to be thought about, we see the signs, right? If the African group comes out saying we want non-use, that somehow doesn't land as a legitimate position. It's somehow seen as people struggle to make sense of it because that's perhaps not seen as a legitimate position. And I'd like to ask, for those the most impacted are saying something, they're taking a position, why is that position not taken at face value by the Alliance for Just Deliberation? Because that's what your aim is, right? To enhance Global South Voices? Yes, please. I'm happy to hear from you.
Yes. PSC has taken no position other than to say that all voices should be heard. So if the African group at UNEA said that they would like to go towards a non-use agreement, we are very supportive of them working towards that with policymakers.
Very good to hear that. Then we are on the same.
All right. Does anyone in the audience have a question? I know we're running a little bit low on time, but.
Oh,
Thank you.
Some people online.
okay. Hi, my question is, what examples from history are there of a successful global non-use agreement? And what lessons are there from those successes? And I'm thinking of the above ground nuclear testing facility, but I'm sure there are others that you may know.
And Sylvia, if you want to jump in here, let us know. Okay, we'll take a few questions then. Who else? Let's see.
Thank you. Arti, yesterday I asked you about transparency, whether we can make progress there. In a similar vein, a non-use agreement, I suppose, would require monitoring. Is there a path where we can strengthen countries' monitoring capabilities so that at least if something were to be done in the stratosphere, decision makers would know in time and be able to respond?
Thanks. Panganga, and I think it was a really important point that you made in your presentation about, the sort of, how the notion of informed consent is sort of rooted in a disrespectful proposition. And what I see is also that, this notion of consent-based processes is being used in a lot of different issues, nuclear waste among them. And I wonder in in the research that you've done or just you're thinking about it, what is informed consent? What does that really entail in terms of, an actual process?
So much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for holding this session. My name's Barbara. I'm from Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. And I was going to ask the panelists how they weigh the dangers of not solar geoengineering and other types of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas removal against enacting these measures to prevent runaway climate change. At the moment, the Earth's energy imbalance is 1.4 watts per square meter. That's equivalent to 11 Hiroshima bombs exploding in Earth's system every second. If we don't cooperate, the heat will kill us all. I'm sorry, this is what James Hansen says. These are the laws of thermodynamics. Mother Earth is dying from what we have done. We've doubled the greenhouse gas equivalent concentration in the atmosphere. So please, please listen to James Hansen and the other climate scientists, not the ones that are just running computer models, but the ones that look at the paleoclimate data.
I have a separate technical question for Sylvia. Solar geoengineering, how does that potentially result in termination shock, sudden temperature rise? I never heard that before.
Great question. And I think the way I'll handle this is I'll have all of our panelists kind of make one final address any of the questions that are kind of up your alley. And I know a lot of folks online ask questions. We're running out of time though. So I think what I'll do is later this week, I'll ask our panelists if they can write short answers to some of the written questions, and then I'll email everyone. So apologies to the online folks. Let's start with Panganga for closing. Sorry.
I'm trying to remember all the questions. So we asked about what free, prior, and informed consent would actually look like. And I'll preface this with saying, again, that's the floor. That's not something that we're really striving for. This is like the bare minimum. Ask me before you do it. There are various forms of this within individual governments in the United States, some folks follow what's called meaningful consultation, and even that is not, even that doesn't meet a good standard. So in our communities, so you would have to change your thinking, really, because Western compartmentalized thinking thinks about things in terms of property rights, and like this tribe owns this property and this tribe owns this property. But when it's a shared ecosystem among the entire Arctic, and there are 500 nations in the United States, and then there are like numerous nations across the world, for that shared ecosystem, you'd really have to consult all of the tribes, and you would have to give them all of the information. And you wouldn't say, because generally what they'll say is, we're doing a small scale test, but you're not revealing what the end result is going to look like. And again, you're talking to people 10 steps too late. You're not asking us what we think the problem is. You're telling us what the problem is. You're telling us what you think the solution is, and then you're asking us if we're okay with it. And what okay means is, are you okay with us spreading silica hollow glass microspheres, which silica causes tuberculosis? It causes kidney disease. We already have high rates of rheumatoid arthritis and tuberculosis in our communities because there's a lot of silica in our roads. And Western science has this flaw of narrowly focusing on single dimensional questions, compartmentalized questions here, here, and here. So when you're thinking about things like the blue clod or the ice, so you lay a bunch of beads on the ice, or you suck water from underneath it, it disrupts the cod, it disrupts the algae. Well, the algae, when it's large enough, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And that's what the bottom dwellers feed on. And we rely on those bottom dwellers to clean up our ocean. There are just so many things that Indigenous peoples understand about our ecosystems, that knowledge is not being tapped into. And if it is, it's still compartmentalized. It's still single dimensional. They're asking this one thing about this one thing, but they're not asking us what our cosmovision is. And our cosmovision is also not being supported by millions of dollars. So.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe I'll try and respond a little bit to your question, and also just wrap up with some thoughts. I mean, what I picked up in your comment was some of what's sometimes referred to as this risk framing, that the risks of climate change are so great that we should perhaps be prepared to contend with the risks of. Yes, yeah, exactly. And like personally, I find this framing really quite unhelpful, because really we should be talking about, a risk on top of a risk that already exists, right? New risks on top of a risk that already exists. And can I fit? So I understand you disagree, but I just wanted to respond to your point. Raymond Pierre Humbert yesterday, put it in a really, a stark way. Like, just because we have broken the climate system already doesn't mean it's a good idea to break it in another way. And I think that's like a really helpful way of understanding it, right? So SRM is messing with an already messed up climate. Marine CDR, for example, is intervening in highly sensitive ocean ecosystems. Oceans are, the largest carbon sink on Earth. They're our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. We know relatively so little about them. We're talking about intervening with really drastic measures in highly sensitive ecosystems with some idea of what it might do to totally undermine those existing carbon stores and sinks, but really, very little to go on. So, there are obviously major challenges in decarbonizing the global economy, right? I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Major challenges. And the desperation is palpable. Yeah. And we need to do so in a way that is fair and equitable, and that recognizes common but differentiated responsibility embedded in the climate regime, Global North shouldering the greatest burden, and, enabling conditions to take the foot off the throat of the Global South, so that to enable poverty eradication, energy access for all, that's how we need to do it. But geoengineering is not going to help with any of that. It's simply going to store up an even bigger problem for the future and for future generations. And who's going to be in control of it? Global North countries, not global South countries, have we seen. So it's not a solution. The challenges are absolutely huge, but relying on some fantasy future techno fix is just going to make the problem even harder. So.
If we don't, can we let Artie? Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think I already used up too much of the time. So I will just, to the person who asked about other areas. So in fact, we've done a extensive sort of legal political analysis of a whole range of other prohibitory regimes. So there's a range of things that the global community has decided are too risky, dangerous, and are prohibited. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, mining in Antarctica, and all sorts of other issues. Also newly emerging issues, deep seabed mining, human cloning, etc. And we've drawn lessons from it. There's no blueprint for solar geoengineering. These are obviously very, very different types of problems, but there are certain design elements from these international regimes that we can learn from. One of those is, as to go to your question, Matthias. I mean, of course, I know you very well, but I never get your name pronounced absolutely correctly. But anyway, to go to your question about monitoring, and that's one of these crucial elements in any sort of non-use regime, right? Ideally, we want to get to a point where the technology doesn't yet exist in the sense that then it's a much higher bar for monitoring. But of course, you want to also be able to monitor to see what is going on in terms of sulfate aerosol injection, if anyone is attempting this at scale, and in a sustained way. So I think that kind of technology does exist. It will be developed, satellites, etc. So I'm quite sure that we will have the capacity to detect unilateral sulfate aerosol injection at any discernible scale. So, but that's important. Yeah, and I think the risk framing was very eloquently addressed by Mary, and I fully agree with what she said.
Sylvia, if you could wrap it up for us, and just a reminder, you had a specific question from the audience about termination shock and what that means.
Yeah, thank you. On termination shock is recognized by, it's mentioned by many scientists, but it was also analyzed in the geoengineering model intercomparison project, the GeoMIP. And you can look at different authors. Look for Alan Robock also, which is a very well-known methodologist. And what happened, termination shock is that when you are applying sulfate aerosol injection over a certain time, or other solar geoengineering, and to have any effect, you have to have it at large scale during a certain time. And then if you suddenly have to interrupt it because of error, technical error, because of conflict, because of change of government or anything, then the temperature will rise rapidly over the level that it was before it started. So this is one of the major problems with solar geoengineering, and that because it means that it is like it creates a captive market. You cannot get out of it, and you have to commit. Is what Artie was explaining. There is no way of really having a fair governance that claims at least 100 or 200 years of one policy. I mean, we have the Paris Agreement, which is a global agreement, and it was and the government of the United States took himself away from the first. It's just to give you if we have such an agreement on solar geoengineering, how could that be managed? So only because of that, I think it could be enough to say we shouldn't take that risk. But I want to address some of the other issues that were said very rapidly. And I particularly want to say that we all here agree that there is a big crisis, okay? The message of the IPCC is not about geoengineering. It's about we have to reduce fossil fuels immediately, rapidly, before 2030, and it has to be drastic. And it's not we who have caused the climate crisis. It's only 10% of the richest people of the world that emit over 50% of all greenhouse emissions. And the US is the principal historical emitter and also the most important emitter per capita and the most important user of energy per capita of the world just now when we're in this crisis. So the issue is, why are we speaking on all these risky technologies that will again be controlled by the same 10% that cause climate crisis, instead of really saying what we need to do is not to discuss all these really speculative technologies, because there is not a single one, not one technology, solar, terrestrial, or marine technology, that can ensure that it will function, because they are all, absolutely all speculative. So there is no reason to trust in this technology instead of going to see what we really can do to prevent climate change to continue. As Panganga said, it's extremely offensive for indigenous people, for peasants, for farmers, for the third world people, like I am based in Mexico, because of all the, hearing these arguments that we already have the climate crisis, but you can stand a little bit more risk with all these risky technologies that we don't know if they will function, but we will control them. No, we can't do that. That's why we need a non-use agreement to stop these technologies. And we need to reinforce the moratorium that are both at London Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity.
All right, thank you so much, Sylvia.
Which is our traditional name for St. Lawrence Island. I would like to give a little bit more background of these burdens we did not create. The Arctic is in a crisis. There used to be 20,000 of us on Sivuca before Western contact. We thrived. And now we used to have 32 villages. We have 2 left. Maybe 900 in our community and 800 in our sister community. We have had our own community-based project since 1997 because the Department of Defense made they built 2 bases on each end of our island during the Cold War. We have been fighting to hold the Department of Defense since then. And now persistent organic pollutants. We come from the Bering Sea. That's our creation story. The ocean, our lands, airs, and waters were intricately tied to them. Our elders call our ocean the farm, our farm. We rely on marine mammals. We are some of the most highly contaminated population on the planet because of our reliance on our subsistence foods. Our main foods, the walrus and seals, are so loaded with PCBs at levels we should not be eating them for excess cancer risk. How would you feel if you had to go to your grocery store? However, my people still feel the benefits outweigh the risk, the nutritional value, our spirituality, tied with our lands, airs, and wildlife. It's our identity. It's not something we can separate ourselves from. And now microplastics. We're a heavy fossil fuel industry state. Our legislators are in bed with the polluters. We don't see benefits from the oil industry. We produced a report for the INC4. We worked 2 years for it. And if you like more information, I can share that. Arctic Ocean now has the most microplastics of all the oceans. 16,000 chemicals in the production of plastics. And as they arrive on our shores, they have absorbed even more toxic chemicals from the ocean. As they arrive through air and ocean currents, they're absorbing even more. These are endocrine disrupting chemicals. When people think we live in the most harshest location on the planet, but our people thrived. We are very rich with tradition and culture and close-knit communities. The Creator provided everything we ever needed for centuries. And now this crisis, another crisis. We've got crisis after crisis. We're running out of time. I'm raising a grandson who has a right to snow, who has a right to ice. With the melting of the ice, our freezers are empty. Our marine mammals that we depend on, our main foods are ice dependent as well. If there's no ice, we have no food. We're seeing species die off of fish, birds, seals, whales. Our food, not only is it killing my people, but it's a food security by burdens we did not create. Time is running out. I have a right to live my life. I have a right to share my language, our creation story, our songs and dances, our traditions and cultures. But these toxic exposures, endocrine disrupting chemicals, are affecting our children's ability to learn. Indigenous people's knowledge on par or greater than Western science. You know, it was very alarming to learn toxic chemicals that can affect their children's ability to learn. How can I pass on my language, our creation story, our songs and dances, our traditions and culture if our children cannot learn? We are running out of time.
Thanks everyone for sticking around.
It's that urgency.
I will.